After 3 years of devastating war that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, Russian President Vladimir Putin has suddenly proposed direct peace talks with Ukraine. The unexpected announcement has sent diplomatic shockwaves across Europe and the United States. But is this a genuine path to peace or just another strategic maneuver in a bloody conflict that shows no sign of ending? In the early hours of Sunday, May 11th, Putin made a televised statement from the Kremlin proposing direct negotiations with Ukraine in Istanbul on May 15th. This dramatic development comes as Russian forces continue to gain ground in eastern Ukraine, and just hours after a high-profile visit to Kyiv by the leaders of Europe's most powerful nations, who demanded Russia agree to an immediate ceasefire. Putin's proposal calls for talks without preconditions, aimed at achieving what he called a long-term, sustainable peace, rather than just a temporary pause in fighting. He specifically suggested Istanbul, Turkey, as the venue, the same city where early negotiations took place in 2022, shortly after Russia's full-scale invasion began. We are proposing that Kyiv resume direct negotiations without any preconditions, Putin stated in his televised address that began around 1:30 a.m. Moscow time. We offer the Kyiv authorities to resume negotiations already on Thursday in Istanbul. The Russian leader emphasized that these talks would seek to eliminate the root causes of the conflict and achieve the restoration of a long-term, lasting peace, rather than simply creating a pause that would allow either side to regroup and rearm. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky responded cautiously on social media, calling Putin's announcement a positive sign that the Russians have finally begun to consider ending the war. However, he insisted that the very first step in truly ending any war is a ceasefire. Zelensky stated Ukraine is ready to meet, but only after Russia confirms a full, lasting, and reliable ceasefire starting May 12th. The timing of Putin's announcement appears carefully calculated. Just hours earlier, the leaders of France, Germany, the UK, and Poland stood alongside Zelensky in Kyiv and issued a joint demand for Russia to accept an unconditional 30-day ceasefire beginning May 12th. They warned of massive new sanctions if Moscow refused. This rare show of European unity marked the first time these four leaders had traveled together to Ukraine, in what Zelensky called a very important signal of support. French President Emmanuel Macron announced that the United States would take the lead in monitoring the proposed ceasefire, with European nations providing support. Putin dismissed these demands as ultimatums from European powers. He pointed to several previous ceasefires Russia had proposed, including a recent 72-hour truce during World War II victory celebrations. According to Putin, Ukraine violated this May ceasefire by attacking Russia with 524 aerial drones, 45 sea drones, a number of Western missiles, and that Russia had repelled 5 attacks on Russian regions. Ukrainian officials, for their part, have consistently accused Russia of violating its own declared truces, creating a pattern of mutual recrimination that has undermined previous ceasefire attempts. The contradiction between peace rhetoric and battlefield reality was starkly highlighted when, despite Putin's peace overture, Russian forces launched a drone attack on Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine just hours after his announcement. Ukrainian officials reported that at least one person was injured in the region surrounding the capital, and several private homes were damaged. U.S. President Donald Trump, who has repeatedly promised to end the war and wants to be remembered as a peacemaker, celebrated the development, writing on Truth Social, "A potentially great day for Russia and Ukraine. Think of the hundreds of thousands of lives that will be saved as this never-ending bloodbath hopefully comes to an end." Trump's special envoy to Ukraine, retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, had stated just a day earlier that a comprehensive 30-day ceasefire will start the process for ending the largest and longest war in Europe since World War II. The U.S. president has previously threatened to walk away from the peace process if a settlement or ceasefire agreement isn't reached soon. French President Emmanuel Macron acknowledged Putin's proposal as a first step, but insisted it's not enough, maintaining that an unconditional ceasefire is not preceded by negotiations. The French leader suggested Putin is looking for a way forward, but also trying to buy time. The conflict, which began when Putin sent thousands of troops into Ukraine in February 2022, has evolved into the gravest confrontation between Russia and the West since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Russian forces now control approximately one-fifth of Ukrainian territory and continue to advance, albeit slowly and at enormous cost to both sides. Putin has previously laid out firm conditions for ending the war. In June 2024, he stated that Ukraine must officially abandon its NATO ambitions and withdraw from 4 Ukrainian regions claimed by Russia: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Russian officials have also demanded U.S. recognition of Russia's territorial gains and Ukraine's neutrality, though Moscow has indicated it wouldn't oppose Ukraine joining the European Union. In his Sunday statement, Putin specifically referenced a draft agreement from early 2022 negotiations in Istanbul. According to that proposal, Ukraine would accept permanent neutrality in exchange for security guarantees from the permanent UN Security Council members: Britain, China, France, Russia, and the United States. It was not Russia that broke off negotiations in 2022. It was Kyiv, Putin claimed. The Russian leader said he would speak with Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan about facilitating the talks, and thanked China, Brazil, African and Middle Eastern countries, and the United States for their mediation efforts. This diplomatic dance reveals the complex dynamics at play in the conflict. Putin's offer comes at a time when his forces hold a relatively strong position on the battlefield, yet Russia faces mounting international pressure and the threat of additional sanctions that could further damage its already isolated economy. The timing suggests Putin may be trying to seize the diplomatic initiative from European leaders and potentially drive a wedge between Ukraine and its Western backers. Analysts note that both sides are trying to blame each other for failing to agree to a ceasefire deal amid pressure from Trump to end the war. With Trump having threatened to walk away from the peace process if there isn't some kind of settlement soon, the question becomes, who will he blame for the failure? If he blames Russia more, full U.S. aid will likely continue to Ukraine, with intensified sanctions against Moscow. If, however, he blames Ukraine, he could suspend U.S. aid and intelligence assistance, drastically weakening Ukraine's military position and strengthening Russia's. For Ukraine, the prospect of talks presents a difficult dilemma. Zelensky's insistence on a ceasefire before negotiations reflects concerns that Putin merely seeks a pause that would allow Russian forces to regroup. Yet continued fighting has taken an enormous toll on Ukraine's military and civilian population, with resources stretched thin despite Western support. The United States under President Trump has shifted its approach compared to the previous administration. While former President Biden and European leaders characterized the invasion as an imperial land grab that must be defeated, Trump has repeatedly expressed his desire to end what he calls the bloodbath of the Ukraine war, which his administration portrays as a proxy conflict between the U.S. and Russia. Putin frames the war differently, as a watershed moment in Moscow's relations with the West. He claims Russia was humiliated after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, when NATO expanded eastward into what he considers Moscow's sphere of influence, including Ukraine. As the world watches whether Ukraine will accept Putin's invitation to Istanbul, the fundamental question remains: is this proposal a genuine step toward ending Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II, or a tactical move in a longer geopolitical struggle? With Russian troops still advancing, European powers threatening new sanctions, and the U.S. eager for resolution, the stakes couldn't be higher. Whether negotiations actually begin on May 15th may determine if 2025 becomes the year this devastating war finally ends, or merely another chapter in a conflict that has already redrawn Europe's security map. The coming days will reveal if the battlefield will give way to the negotiating table, or if the bloodshed will continue with no end in sight. After 3 years of war, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and millions of displaced people, even the possibility of peace has ignited hope. But that hope remains cautious and fragile in a conflict defined by broken promises and shattered truces. What do you think? Will these proposed talks actually happen? And could they really lead to peace?